The snow had been falling for 3 days without pause, soft at first, then heavy, as if the sky had decided to bury the world in silence. The pines bowed under the weight, the valley sealed in white. Inside a half-collapsed cabin, a woman lay curled on the floorboards, wrapped in a torn quilt that smelled faintly of smoke and old blood. Her lips were cracked, her breath thin and irregular. She had stopped calling for help hours ago. The sound had only made her lonelier. The wind found its way through the broken boards, whispering like a ghost across her skin. She blinked once, twice, trying to focus on the frost forming on the windowpane. Beyond it, she saw the dim shape of a world she was no longer sure was real. Pine shadows, drifting snow, and somewhere far off, the echo of hooves. When the door creaked open, she didn't stir. A shape filled the doorway, tall as the frame would allow, a man bare to the cold, the muscles of his chest dark and gleaming beneath a fur cloak. Snow clung to his hair and shoulders. His eyes, black as obsidian, scanned the room. For a moment he only watched her, as if unsure whether she belonged to the living. Then he stepped inside, his shadow stretching over her like a second blanket. Elias Greywolf had not meant to find anyone that day. He had been looking for a stray heifer, following tracks that vanished in the storm. What he found instead was the quietest sound of all, a woman's heartbeat, faint but fighting. He knelt, his breath misting against her face. She flinched weakly when his calloused hand touched her wrist. "You hear me?" he murmured. His voice was deep but soft, a tone that seemed to come from the earth itself. Her lashes fluttered. She tried to speak, but only managed a broken whisper. "Please, don't." He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted her easily into his arms. Her body felt weightless, her skin like paper against his chest. She tried once to resist, a trembling hand pushing against him, but her strength failed before the thought could finish. Outside, the snow swallowed their footprints as he carried her toward his lodge, a cabin of rough-hewn logs built against the shoulder of a hill. Smoke rose from its chimney, a faint promise of warmth in a world gone pale. When he laid her down by the fire, the contrast nearly hurt her eyes. The gold of flame, the red of life. He stoked the fire higher, then crouched beside her with a kettle of melted snow. His movements were slow, careful, like a man handling a wild bird. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, uncertain if he was real or a fevered dream. He spoke again, this time in a language she didn't know, low syllables that sounded more like prayer than words. When she coughed, he lifted her gently, letting her drink from a wooden cup. The water stung her throat but loosened something deeper. For the first time in days, she remembered she had a name. "Helen," she rasped. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Helen," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were sacred. She studied him in the firelight, the sharp bones of his face, the scar that crossed his collarbone, the calm stillness in his eyes. She'd heard of men like him from the traders who passed through town, Apaches, fierce and silent, wild as the mountains they roamed. But there was nothing wild about the way he moved now. There was only care, and a loneliness that mirrored her own. She slept then, drifting in and out of fever. Sometimes she dreamt of the past, the slam of a door, the sting of a slap, a man's voice full of liquor and hate. Each time she woke, she expected that same shadow standing over her. Instead, she found the quiet shape of Elias beside the fire, carving something from wood. His knife moved slowly, rhythmically, as though time itself waited on his blade. When she finally woke clear-headed, dawn had come. The snow outside had stopped, and light spilled through the window like melted gold. Elias was gone, but he had left a bowl of broth beside her and a folded blanket across her legs. The scent of sage hung in the air. She sat up with effort, her ribs aching beneath her dress. The cabin was sparse but orderly. Pelts hung on one wall, tools gleamed where they'd been cleaned. There was a gentleness in the way everything had its place, as though the man who lived here had wrestled chaos into calm by hand. She ate slowly, each sip of broth awakening her senses. When the door opened again, she froze. He entered with an armful of firewood, snow melting in his hair. Their eyes met, and for a breath neither spoke. "I'll go," she whispered hoarsely. "I don't want trouble." He set the wood down and shook his head. "You'll die out there." I already have, she said, her voice almost breaking. He looked at her a long time, then turned back to the fire. Eat. Then talk. Something in his tone, quiet but final, made her obey. The heat from the fire soaked through her bones, bringing a sting of life she hadn't asked for. When she spoke again, it was only to fill the silence. My husband, he left me here. Said I wasn't worth the bullets to finish. Her voice trembled, not from fear but shame. He said no one would come. Elias stirred the fire. Sparks leapt upward, then vanished. He was wrong. Those words hit harder than she expected. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she turned away before they could fall. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer comfort. But the space between them softened, like the thaw after a long freeze. Later, while he cleaned a wound on her arm, she noticed the scars across his back. They weren't fresh. Old burns, old whips, old stories that no one had ever asked about. Her lips parted to speak, then closed. Whatever pain he carried, he had made peace with it, and she hadn't earned the right to touch it yet. By nightfall, her strength began to return. She tried to stand and nearly fell. His hand caught her before she hit the floor, large, steady, gentle. The moment lingered. His breath brushed her temple. She could feel the warmth of him even through the cold. Rest, he said. Tomorrow, we find your name again. She frowned faintly. I told you my name. He shook his head. Not the one the world gave you. The one you lost. Outside, the wind picked up again, sweeping snow against the windows. She watched his silhouette move through the cabin, feeding the fire, setting a pot to boil, always turning away before their eyes could meet too long. It was as if both of them feared what might awaken if silence became something more. That night, she dreamed of walking through a blizzard, and somewhere ahead, a voice called her by a name she didn't yet know. When she woke, the room was still dark, but she could hear him outside, splitting wood beneath the rising moon. She wrapped the blanket tighter and stared at the door. For the first time in months, she felt the faint, unfamiliar pulse of safety, and with it came confusion, even guilt. What right did she have to feel safe in another man's home, under another man's mercy? But when she heard his voice outside, low, steady, humming a wordless tune that rose and fell with the axe's rhythm, her heart quieted. She realized that fear and peace could sound the same when you'd forgotten what either felt like. By morning, the snow had returned, heavy and endless. She woke to the smell of coffee and bread. Elias placed a cup beside her without a word. Steam curled between them like breath shared in the cold. Why? She asked softly. Why help me? He looked out the window, where the world was nothing but white and wind. Because you were alone, he said. And I was too. The words hung there, fragile as frost. For the first time, she smiled. Small, hesitant, but real. Outside, the storm began to thicken again, erasing all trails leading in or out. Inside, two strangers sat by the fire, bound by silence and the slow thaw of something neither dared to name. And though she didn't yet know it, the blizzard that trapped her had also begun to set her free. The thaw began slowly, not in the weather but in the silence between them. The blizzard had quieted, leaving behind a world wrapped in white. Helen stood by the window, her fingers resting on the sill, eyes following the smoke that rose from the chimney and vanished into pale morning light. The valley below looked asleep, untouched and innocent, yet she knew what kind of words would be riding on the wind soon. Elias had gone into town for supplies. He hadn't said much before leaving, just handed her a shawl and said, "Keep the fire fed." She had nodded, watching his tall frame disappear into the snow. Now she waited, heart restless, the quiet pressing against her like a weight. She touched her bruised cheek in the reflection of the frosted glass. The yellow fading to green, the line where a ringed hand had struck her again and again. He'd found her like that, half dead, unrecognizable, and still hadn't asked a single question. There was mercy in that silence. But mercy, she was learning, could feel heavy too. By midday, the door opened. Elias entered, shaking snow from his shoulders, carrying sacks of flour and beans. A streak of frost cut across his jaw, and his eyes were darker than the storm outside. He placed the food down without a word. "Did they ask about me?" she said quietly. He didn't answer. His hands were steady, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. They talked, he said finally. What did they say? That you should have stayed where you belonged. The words stung, though they weren't new. She had known towns like this one all her life, small hearts guarding smaller laws. And what did you tell them? I told them I found a person half buried in snow. I told them I don't ask what color a soul is before I save it. Her throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt too fragile beside his steadiness. You shouldn't defend me, she whispered. It'll only turn them on you. He met her gaze. They already have. That night, the fire burned low. She sat close to it, mending one of his shirts by hand. The rhythm soothed her, the pull of thread, the small sigh of fabric. He sat at the table, cleaning his knife, glancing at her now and then without speaking. You've got scars, she said softly, breaking the quiet. Old ones. He looked down at his hands, the skin marked by lines of ash and blade. The cavalry left them. Long ago. Why? Because I stayed. The words hung in the air, bare and heavy. He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask. In the long hush that followed, she understood what he meant. He had refused to leave his land, his people, his honor. And they had made him pay for it. Later, when she went to pour water into the kettle, she caught him watching her. Not with hunger, but with something quieter, respect, perhaps curiosity, maybe even ache. The kind of look that saw without demanding. Tomorrow, he said, I'll ride into town again. I need nails and feed. Take me, she said, too quickly. He frowned. You're not ready. I can walk. And I want them to see me alive. They should know I'm not what they're saying. His eyes softened, but his voice remained low. They don't need proof. They need peace. And they don't have it in them. She lowered her gaze. Then I'll find it in me. The next day, while he rode out alone, the storm broke for a few hours. Sunlight spilled through the clouds, touching the snow like gold leaf. She stepped outside for the first time in weeks, her boots sinking deep. The air was sharp enough to cut. From the ridge she could see the distant town, a cluster of roofs beneath the white hills. For a moment she imagined walking back there, showing them her face, telling them she was not ruined. But the thought faded when she realized there was no home waiting, only walls and whispers. By the time Elias returned, dusk had settled. He looked tired, his coat flecked with ice. He handed her a parcel of cloth and a small tin of sugar. A woman named Martha sent these, he said. Why? She said every house deserves sweetness. Helen smiled faintly, then hesitated. Did they speak of me again? They always will, he replied. That night, she made coffee for them both. The steam rose between them, curling like words unsaid. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked. Of what? Being the one they point at. He stirred his cup slowly. It doesn't matter what they point at. Only who you face. She studied him through the flicker of firelight, the quiet strength, the calm forged from years of being judged and surviving anyway. Something inside her shifted. For the first time, she wanted to live not out of defiance, but because she saw a life that could hold her without breaking. The days began to fall into rhythm. Morning chores, evening fire, the steady hum of winter's stillness. She learned to grind corn, to patch boots, to tend the fire the way he did, with patience. He taught her without teaching, showing by doing, always quiet, always watching. Once, when she burned her hand on the stove, he took it in his and pressed a cool cloth against it. The touch was brief but lingering. She felt her pulse tremble where his fingers met her skin. Neither spoke. Outside, snow fell again, slow and endless. Weeks passed. The gossip in town grew louder. Martha Bell heard it all, the talk of the Apache who'd stolen a white woman, the sheriff's threats to ride out if need be. One afternoon, she found Elias by the well, his horse tied nearby. You can't hide forever, she said. The town won't let you. I don't hide, he answered. I live. She studied him for a long moment, her old eyes sharp but kind. If she's staying with you, you'd best be ready to fight twice, once for her, once for your peace. He nodded once. I've fought worse things than men. That evening, he returned late. Helen was asleep by the fire, her hair falling loose across her shoulders. He paused in the doorway, watching her breathe. The soft sound steadied him, anchored him against the noise of the world. When she stirred and saw him, she smiled. Small, uncertain, but true. Did they trouble you again? She asked. He knelt beside her, setting his rifle aside. They talk of law, he said. But law is just words written by men who've never known mercy. Her gaze lingered on him. Then what's mercy to you? He looked at her hand resting near his. Something that stays, even when it's easier to leave. Silence stretched, long and fragile. The fire cracked, a log collapsing into ember. Their hands almost touched, almost, but not yet. Outside, a wind rose through the valley, carrying faint voices from town, the sound of distant hooves. Somewhere in that wind was warning, but neither of them spoke it aloud. He glanced toward the door, his expression shifting from calm to watchful. Tomorrow, someone will come, he murmured. Who? The kind that knocks with anger instead of hands. Helen looked toward the window, where the snow had begun again, heavier this time, swirling like ash. The firelight shimmered against the glass, casting both their reflections into the storm. Two souls blurred together by flame and frost. And as the wind howled through the cracks of the old cabin, she whispered to herself, barely louder than the storm. Let them come! For the first time, the fear in her voice sounded almost like courage. The snow had turned to glass by morning, crusted and shining beneath the pale sun. Every step broke it with a crunch that sounded too loud for the silence that had settled over the valley. Elias saddled his horse early, his movements measured, deliberate. Helen watched from the doorway, wrapped in his old fur cloak. The cold burned her cheeks, but it was not the weather that made her tremble. It was the look in his eyes. They'll come today, he said quietly, adjusting the cinch. Sheriff Doone rides with them. She didn't ask how he knew. He always knew when danger was on its way. Some men read tracks in mud, others in eyes. Elias read it in the wind. She stepped closer, her voice barely carrying. Can we leave before they do? He shook his head. Running tells them they're right. Standing tells them they're not. Helen swallowed, the truth cutting sharper than fear. They won't understand. They don't need to. He paused, lifting his gaze to her. Only you do. He said it without tenderness, but the words found a place inside her that had been hollow too long. She nodded, unsure if the motion came from courage or from the exhaustion of hiding. By noon, the riders appeared, a dark line against the snow. 6 of them, led by Sheriff Doone in his gray coat and polished badge. Behind him trailed 2 townsmen she recognized. Mr. Wade, who sold grain, and a boy named Avery, who once flirted with her outside the church before learning her husband's fists were quicker than his own. The riders halted near the edge of the clearing. Hooves churned up powder, breath steaming. Doone's voice broke the stillness. Elias Greywolf. Elias stepped out from beside the cabin, coat open to the cold, chest bare beneath the wind. He did not reach for his gun. You found me, he said simply. Doone's jaw tightened. I heard you've been harboring a woman, white woman half dead, taken from her lawful husband. The town wants her returned. Helen flinched. She had known this moment would come, yet hearing it aloud scraped the wound raw again. Elias stood unmoving, the snow catching in his dark hair like ash. She's not a thing to be returned, he said. That ain't your choice. Doone nodded toward the cabin. Call her out. Elias didn't move. His stillness was heavier than any threat. She's inside. But if you want to see her, you'll speak to her like a person, not a prize. Wade spat into the snow. You think you can tell us how to talk, half-breed? You think you can keep what don't belong to you? Helen stepped outside then, before the world could tear open. The cold bit through her thin dress, but she didn't feel it. The men's eyes widened, the bruises still faint on her face, her hair tangled, her frame too thin. She stood beside Elias, trembling but upright. I came here on my own, she said. My husband left me to die. This man saved me. Dune's voice hardened. That don't change what's right. He's not your kind. My kind? She laughed, bitter and low. My kind left me bleeding in the snow. My kind let it happen. The sheriff's eyes flicked toward Elias. You can't stay here, both of you. You'll bring trouble. Trouble's already here, Elias said. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Dune turned his horse. You've got till dawn, he said over his shoulder. After that, law rides in full. The men followed him down the hill, their silhouettes shrinking into the white horizon. Only the wind remained, whispering through the pines. Helen sank to her knees in the snow, shaking. I've ruined you, she whispered. Elias knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. You didn't bring the storm, he said. It was already waiting. That night, the firelight trembled across the walls. Helen couldn't sleep. She sat by the hearth, staring at the coals until their red glow blurred. Elias sat near the door, sharpening his knife, quiet as the dark itself. Why do you never ask me about before? She murmured. He looked up, the blade pausing mid-motion. Because I know what pain sounds like when it doesn't need to be spoken. Her throat tightened. I don't even remember who I was before him. Just his voice. His hands. Like he carved me hollow. Elias leaned forward, eyes steady. Then fill what's left. With anything but hate. She watched the fire flicker between them, feeling something thaw inside, a warmth that frightened her more than the cold ever had. Near midnight, she went outside. The sky was full of stars, the snow gleaming like crushed glass. The air burned her lungs. She turned toward the barn, where Elias was checking his horse. They'll come at dawn, she said. He nodded, tightening a strap. Yes. And you'll fight them. If I must. You'll die. He straightened, his height shadowing her. Then I die standing. The words struck her like an oath she didn't want. Don't, she said, voice breaking. Don't die for me. He looked at her a long moment, then spoke in a voice that seemed carved from stone and sorrow. Then live for me. The silence that followed was unbearable. She turned away, tears freezing on her cheeks. When she went back inside, she found his rifle propped against the wall, and his knife laid neatly beside it. The gesture felt like a promise, or a goodbye. Hours later, the sound of hooves broke the dawn. She ran to the window. A group of riders approached. Not 6 this time, but 8, their torches bleeding light into the snow. Dune led them, his badge glinting in the weak sun. Elias was already outside, standing bare-chested again as if the cold meant nothing. Helen grabbed his coat and ran to him. Please, she whispered. Don't meet them like this. I have nothing to hide, he said. You have everything to lose. He turned then, looking at her as though trying to memorize her face. Everything I have is right here. The riders fanned out across the clearing. Dune raised his rifle. I gave you your chance, Grey Wolf. Step aside. Elias didn't move. There's no law here but mercy, he said. Wade barked. Then she can show mercy by leaving. I did leave, Helen shouted. Her voice echoed, wild and shaking. I left the man who beat me, left the world that said I was property. I won't leave the only place I was treated like I mattered. A murmur ran through the men, uneasy, uncertain. Dune's grip on his rifle faltered for half a second, and Elias saw it. He stepped forward slowly, his voice low but carrying. You're not fighting me. You're fighting the truth that she's free. And you don't like what that looks like. For a moment, even the wind held still. Then Dune lowered his weapon, though his face stayed hard. You can't hide forever, he said. I'm not hiding, Elias replied. The sheriff turned his horse, signaling the others. You've bought yourself a day, he said. After that, I can't promise who rides next. When they were gone, Helen sank into the snow again, sobbing. Elias stood beside her, eyes fixed on the fading trail. They'll be back, she whispered. Yes. What will you do? He didn't answer at first. He just looked toward the horizon, where the clouds were gathering again. "Storm's coming," he said finally. She followed his gaze. The sky was darkening, gray folding into black, the promise of another blizzard. "Will it ever stop?" He turned to her then, his expression softening. "Not the storm," he said. "But what we build under it, that's what lasts." The wind rose, scattering snow through the air. She reached for his hand without thinking, her fingers cold against his rough palm. He didn't pull away. They stood together, silent, two figures half lost in the white. Then, from far down the valley, came another sound. Hooves again, heavier this time, and more of them. Elias's hand tightened around hers. His eyes, calm until now, hardened like flint. "That's not the sheriff," he said. Helen's breath caught. "Then who?" He looked toward the ridge, where dark shapes began to crest the hill. Men riding fast, rifles glinting in the early light. Her heart dropped as recognition struck. "My husband," she whispered. Elias turned to her, his voice low and steady, the storm reflected in his gaze. "Stay inside," he said. "This time, I ride for you." And before she could speak he was already moving. Snow exploding beneath his boots, the sound of his breath lost to the wind, as the storm and the past came rushing back together. The first shot cracked through the still air like a scream. It shattered the dawn's calm, scattering a flock of ravens from the pines. Helen jerked awake, the sound echoing through the valley. Her breath caught as she saw the riders cresting the ridge, her husband at their head, his coat flapping like a black flag in the wind. She ran to the door, snow biting her bare feet, just as Elias strode across the clearing. His breath smoked in the cold, his skin bare to the waist, a dark figure carved against the white. The men below reined their horses, startled for a heartbeat by the sight of him. Broad, still watching. Helen's husband, Jeremiah Holt, dismounted, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. His eyes gleamed with the arrogance of a man who had never been stopped. "You've got something of mine," he called, voice dripping poison. Elias didn't move. "Nothing here belongs to you." Jeremiah laughed, a cold sound. "You think a woman like that makes her own choices? She's mine by law, by blood, by every word she ever spoke before you found her." Helen stepped forward, the fur cloak trailing behind her. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the wind. "You left me to die, Jeremiah. You don't get to call that love." He sneered. "I gave you a home, didn't I?" Elias's hand brushed against the knife at his belt, slow and deliberate. "A home doesn't bleed." Jeremiah's men shifted, uneasy. They weren't used to being met with calm instead of fear. Jeremiah spat into the snow. "You really think you'll keep her? You think this town will let an Apache claim what's white?" Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't need their permission to do what's right." The words seemed to hang in the air, more dangerous than any weapon. Jeremiah's face hardened. "Then die with her." He raised his gun. The shot came before Helen could scream. Elias moved first, an instinct born of countless fights, of a life that had taught him to read motion faster than words. The bullet grazed his shoulder as he lunged forward, knocking Jeremiah off his feet. The snow exploded beneath them. The world blurred into chaos. Men shouted, horses reared, gunfire cracked. Helen ducked behind the doorframe, heart hammering. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, sharp and bitter. Through the haze she saw Elias move like a storm made flesh, silent, precise, unstoppable. He struck with strength but never cruelty, every movement measured, protecting more than avenging. Two men fell, one screaming, one silent. Jeremiah crawled backward through the snow, eyes wide, hands scrambling for his pistol. Elias reached him first. The blade caught the morning light as it pressed against Jeremiah's throat. Helen ran to them, breathless, shaking. "Elias, stop." He didn't look at her. His jaw was set, his voice low, trembling not from rage but memory. "Men like him took everything I had once. My brother. My mother. My peace." Jeremiah choked out a laugh, even now unrepentant. "You think she's any better? She'll leave you too. It's in her kind." Something flickered in Elias's eyes, Not anger but sorrow. He lifted the knife slightly, then let it fall. The blade sank into the snow beside Jeremiah's head. "No," he said softly. "It's not in hers. It's in yours." He stood, turning away. "Leave this valley. Don't come back." Jeremiah staggered up, clutching his jaw. "You'll regret this." Elias didn't reply. He simply turned and walked back toward the cabin, blood staining the snow behind him. The men gathered their fallen and rode off, dragging Jeremiah with them. The sound of hooves faded until the only noise left was the wind whispering through the pines. Helen fell to her knees beside him. His shoulder was bleeding badly. "You're hurt," she said, pressing her hands to the wound. He smiled faintly, breath ragged. "You're worse. You stayed." Her tears froze on her lashes. "You'd have done the same." He looked at her, eyes dark and steady even through pain. "Yes. And that's what scares me." She tore strips from her dress and wrapped his arm, her hands shaking. "Don't talk like that," she said. "You saved me." He caught her wrist gently, his fingers rough but careful. "No, Helen. You saved me. You gave me something worth standing for again." For a long moment neither spoke. The sun rose higher, turning the snow gold. The world looked reborn, though blood still marred the ground. Elias leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closing. "It's done," he murmured. "No," she whispered, voice breaking. "It's beginning." Later, when the bleeding had slowed, she coaxed him inside. The cabin glowed with firelight, warm against the frozen world outside. She poured water over his hands, cleaning the blood from his skin. He didn't flinch when she touched him now. The silence between them was no longer fragile, it was full. She looked at him, at the man who had risked his life for hers, who had chosen mercy when vengeance would have been easier. The firelight caught the curve of his jaw, the scar that traced his collarbone, the strength that lived not in his arms but in his restraint. "You should rest," she said. He opened his eyes, and the way he looked at her made her forget the cold. "Helen," he whispered, "I meant what I said." She frowned softly. "What?" "That you're my wife now. If you wish it." The words sank into her like warmth after frost. She hadn't known how much she needed to hear them until now, not because they promised safety, but because they offered choice. Her voice came small, trembling but sure. "I wish it." He reached for her hand, guiding it to his heart. His pulse beat steady beneath her palm. "Then let this be the law between us," he said. "No judge, no preacher, just truth." Tears slid down her cheeks. "And the town?" She whispered. "What will they say?" He smiled faintly. "Let them talk. Storms pass. Words fade." She leaned her forehead against his, their breaths mingling. "And us? We stay." Outside, the last of the clouds broke apart. Light spilled through the window, laying a golden stripe across their faces. The wind had died. Only the faint hiss of melting snow remained. By afternoon, Martha Bell rode up the hill, her shawl flapping behind her. She dismounted, taking in the scene. The patched-up man, the woman with fire in her eyes, the peace in the air. "You two look like sin and salvation wrestled and called it love," she muttered, though her tone was soft. Helen smiled through exhaustion. "It's over." Martha shook her head. "No, child. It's just quieter now." She handed over a basket of bread, then turned to Elias. "You keep her safe. You hear?" Elias nodded. "Always." When Martha left, the valley was silent again. The snow was melting into thin rivulets, running down the hill like silver threads. Helen stood beside the doorway, watching the sky turn amber. She felt the weight of the past easing off her shoulders, melting like ice in spring. Elias joined her, his arm in a sling, his presence steady beside her. The air smelled of pine and smoke, of earth waking again. She looked up at him and whispered, "Do you think we'll be left alone now?" He glanced toward the horizon where the sun bled gold into the mountains. "No one's ever truly alone," he said. "But maybe that's the mercy of it." She smiled faintly, leaning against him. The light caught in her hair, in his dark eyes, in the quiet that bound them. And when the last edge of the sun dipped behind the ridge, the world held still, just long enough for one promise to settle between them, soft as breath, certain as dawn. They had survived the storm. But what grew after it, that was the truer miracle.